So, those of you that made it, thanks for coming out on such a shitty night. This is the final lecture in the part 1 of Culture, Power and Politics. Part 2 will not be starting until probably about mid-April. There's a reason. The reason for that is that my colleague Jeremy Gilbert brings in guest speakers, and academics, we're all teaching until pretty much the end of April. So we get the best guest speakers if we wait until April. So sorry that you have to wait so long for part 2, but believe me, it will be worth it.
Can we not do part 1 again?
I'd love to, but I kind of get knackered. But thank you for that.
Maybe we can teach each other.
Yeah.
Revision.
Well, we can find new kind of knowledge.
Club, read something, meet, and
Let's talk about it after.
Yeah, set up a reading group now that you've got the basic knowledge. Anything you get, any gaps you want to fill in. In fact, one of the things I used to do before I started doing these lectures was actually reading groups. But I started doing the lectures because people asked me to. So, and I would, if you wanted to set up a reading group, I'd be very happy to turn up. Okay, so it's a shame it's raining so much. I really did want more people to be here tonight for this one, because I think it's very important at the moment that we discuss feminism. It's certainly important that we discuss gender. And I cannot do the whole history of feminism tonight, obviously. The lecture the week before last kind of prepared the ground for this week. But I put this lecture together over the past few days whenever I had a moment, and I kept putting things in and taking things out because there is so much information. So what you're left with tonight is something a bit idiosyncratic. There are gaps necessarily, but you can go and fill them in yourselves. And what I've done is somehow I've skipped actually a lot of the famous people. There's a few famous people in here. There are a few not so famous people that I happen to know about that I think are very important and that have contributed to feminist ideas and what we would want to now call the history of feminist thought from pretty much throughout the 20th century. And we're sort of coming up to date, but not too much, because I think the grounds for feminist ideas and our ideas about gender right now actually emerged throughout the 20th century. And I've got a slide that goes way back to actually the 17th century, 16th century. Anyway, you'll see in a minute. Feminism is not new. We have been discussing gender and wondering about gender roles for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the same arguments keep coming back. And one of my projects really is to ask, what are we doing right now? Because I think that, some very exciting things have happened. We've started to question gender. We've started to accept that people may not be gendered in a binary way. We've started to question the relationship between the supposed sexes. And again, that's something else, as I made clear week before last, we can actually question biological sex as much as we can question gender. So we've started to interrogate the relationship and the inequality in that relationship. We started to interrogate things like the nuclear family, which has been a problem. And believe me, it's a huge problem. It's been a problem for a very, very long time. But people are experimenting now with different ways of relating to each other. Nevertheless, I can see in what is happening at the moment a lack of analysis and a lack of understanding of where inequalities originate. We talk a huge amount about inequality. We particularly talk a huge amount about gender inequality. But I haven't heard a great deal of discussion recently about the origin of these inequalities. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that I'm going to say that most of those inequalities that we experience in what you might want to call the modern world emerge from capitalism. They are essentially, economics is at the root of gender inequalities. So one of the things that I will state right now that I'm very much against is what a famous feminist psychoanalyst, Julia Kristeva, said is called she was writing at a time before the feminist movement had got reinvigorated as it has now. And she was looking forward to what she called the third wave of feminism. And forget the waves, I find them problematic. But she was writing in the 1970s and she said, I can see another wave coming, but, it's just going to be useless if all we're doing is fabricating a few chiefs among us. And I've never forgotten that. And that is precisely what tends to be happening. So people like Hillary Clinton, a fabricated chief, somebody who happens to have a uterus and breasts and who is held up by a political party as, we're feminist. We're putting a woman forward for the role of president. Unfortunately, it did. I wish it had worked, actually, considering what they got across the Atlantic. So just separating ourselves for a moment, which of course you can't do, but it feels good to do it. So I think that what we need to do is to go back to the discussions that we had throughout the 20th century about gender inequality, its relationship to economics, and also forward to the future. What I'm going to do in my final slide is present some ideas to you that I work with in my own work, which is critical posthumanism. I'm not going to go into it at any length. I hope that what's going to happen is that I will be able to give a lecture about it when Jeremy takes over next April. But for me, this is kind of where feminism has to go. To cut a long story short, that I think that we are well placed now to question what the hell we mean when we designate someone human, when we designate ourselves as human. And you'll see what I mean, hopefully, throughout this lecture. Okay. Oh, my PowerPoint didn't work. So I've had nightmares with my computer, so I've got this kind of weird, this weird PDF that doesn't work properly, so apologies for that. Okay, so this is just kind of a recap of what we did week before last. First of all, that the idea of woman is a historical category. This is very much a cultural studies approach. My whole background is in cultural studies. And cultural studies looks at the history of culture and how ideas are determined throughout the history of culture and the influence of economics and social structures and how those ideas are determined. So we're looking at cultural history. And of course, woman is a historical category. So the idea of what a woman is or what a woman should be has always been responsive to changes in social structures and the corresponding power relations. So women have not always been defined in the same way throughout the history of the West or even throughout the history of the world. So whatever, you can move between cultures and you can find different historical descriptions and understandings of what it means to be a woman. The other thing that we discussed week before last is this idea that powerful discourses structure how we understand gender and consequently how it is policed. Now, I did a whole lecture on the work of Michel Foucault, and as I said earlier in this lecture series, we studied a lot of dead white European males. There's a very good reason for that, is that the 20th century feminism was a response to a lot of these dead white European males. And as you will see, and as we have already seen week before last, not only a response to them, but taking over their ideas and making them work for a gender critique. Ideas are not, they're not the province of whoever thought of them. They're not the province of any one specific group, specific social group, or specific group of people, okay? They are there out in the world, and we can make whatever use of them we want to. In fact, Michel Foucault himself called them the toolkit. And I think that, this makes perfect sense to me. So, he's dead. He's not going to care. So we can make use of his ideas in order to structure a critique of gender. So, as I said last week, powerful discourses, among them, and there are many, medical, scientific, of course, medical and scientific are the same thing in some cases, and social, psychological predominantly structure how we understand gender and consequently how it is policed. Remember, week before last, I said that gender is policed, and you will see when we get particularly to Judith Butler that it is something that we police in ourselves and we police in other people. There doesn't have to be, you know, a big sign saying keep off the grass. Actually, keep off the grass is such a weird one. I often use it because people obey it. And all I want to say is, or what? And it's pretty much the same with conforming to gender roles and responding to the policing that we are all subject to in the cultures that we live in and enjoy. So next point there, social institutions like the family, the school and the law and many, many others enforce gender conformity. So we're not just policed by others in the culture, but there are, you know, social institutions pretty much ensure that we learn what gender means, we learn how it should be enacted, and it is enacted, as you will see, and police us into behaving correctly according to specific genders. And remember week before last that I introduced you to this idea of habitus, which was thought up initially by this French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about the way that our mostly unconscious social behaviour constantly reinforces gender. Now, he was talking about social class and gender, as I've said before, very closely allied. And as you'll see this week, race and gender are inseparable. And race and gender are policed together, as you will see. And largely, the way we police it is unconscious. So it's to do with social interaction where we really don't know that we're doing it. We actually police other people and ourselves constantly, and half the time it is not conscious. It is simply something that we do without thinking about it. This is habitus. And a couple of final points, that women's bodies are marked by gender. This is from feminist theory throughout the 20th century, that man is the default position for human. Therefore, if your body is marked as a woman, that somehow you become the other. You are other to the human. You are what exists to define the dominant gender and the dominant form of body. So, in other words, think of it like this, that there's a lot of people hanging around with breasts and uteruses and various other things that would go towards identifying what we think a woman is, who simply function to identify the dominant form of body, which is the masculine body. Okay, we can interrogate this later, but this is an axiom of feminist theory throughout the 20th century, certainly actually earlier than that in some cases. So women's bodies are a constant site of political struggle. And this is not only to do with feminism, this is not only to do with the fact that we, women who are involved in feminist struggle, are demanding security in our own bodies, are demanding to do what we want with our own bodies and not to have our bodies policed, but that women's bodies are a target in war. Women's bodies are a target for austerity. All political enforcement, anything that is enforced, tends to land on women's bodies first and foremost. And largely the reason for this is because women give birth. Okay, everybody all right so far? So I just wanted to refer to intersectionality before we go any further. You may have heard of this term. It was a term that was originally coined by the US legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She's got an accent over her last E. I just couldn't be bothered to find it on the keyboard. You'll know who she is. Kimberly Crenshaw. She described this first of all in 1989. And the term was coined to interrogate the relationship between racial, class and gender oppression. As far as she was concerned, within the law, and say she's a legal scholar, so what she's looking at is the way that particularly people of colour are treated in the law courts. Women of colour in the law courts are suffering from a dual oppression. So they're suffering from problems because of their skin colour, but they're also suffering from problems because they're women. She said we have to think about this. We have to think about the intersection of race and gender. I want to take it a bit further. I want to take it because Crenshaw was largely interested in women's equality under the law. I'm just going to sort of extend it somewhat because I think it's a very useful idea. I'm going to say that you cannot separate gender oppression from racial oppression in any circumstances whatsoever. And you'll see what I mean in subsequent slides. The colonisation of women's bodies by medicine, by the law, by rape in war, by the sort of things like enforced sterilisation and abortion and forced abortion are always racially motivated. So when women's bodies are colonised, when they are taken over, in other words, by these institutions, in order to police what happens within the uterus, which is basically what's going on, you cannot separate that from racial prejudice and from anxieties connected to race. And as you'll see what I mean in a minute. So discourses of sex and reproduction are inseparable from discourses of race. In many ways, I mean, Michel Foucault would tell you this as well, and in many ways it's obvious that when you're talking about sex and reproduction, you're talking about something that is highly policed. The people care about the kinds of babies that are being produced. Obviously, people care about babies being produced that are healthy, but even that idea of natal health is tied up with race. And the idea of reproducing very specific people, bringing people into the world who conform to certain racial ideas. You'll see what I mean. I did say this week before last, this is just reinforcing some of what I've already said. So women's bodies are thought of throughout history as vessels of genealogy. There's a huge amount of anxiety about women's bodies and what can we do, what can medicine do to ensure that women's bodies are not only healthy for the women themselves and the children that they give birth to, but of the right type to give birth to the right kind of children. And you see a lot of this discourse in colonial discourse is full of this. It's full of anxieties about racial mixing. So because women are thought of as the biological sex, the gender that is unable to police ourselves. So there's a great deal of policing of women's bodies, particularly in the 19th century by the great colonial powers. So our bodies are vessels of genealogy and the ground on which contests over racial superiority are fought. And that's all women, women of colour, women who may identify as white women, all women. That is, our bodies are, whether you like it or not, are a ground on which these contests are constantly being battled over. So, this is for you. If you've been here before, you'll know that we do these exercises where I ask you to consider something, discuss with each other, and then we'll have a general discussion for 10 minutes before we go on with the lecture. This should be familiar. we see this all the time. This is a very specific imaging of the theory of evolution. If you were here the week before last, you'll know I spoke quite a lot about the theory of evolution, about Darwin, and some of the assumptions that he made about women's bodies in the Descent of Man. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to have a look at this image, look at it closely, and if you need to, come closer to have a look at it, and tell me what's wrong with it. Discuss it with each other. I'll give you 5 minutes.
We were just saying, where are the females in this scheme?
Good point. Are there any females?
Yeah, the one on the end.
No.
She doesn't exist.
No.
The third one is,
Well,
isn't it?
depends.
Isn't there a lady
You
in
wanna
the-
call, yeah, because she had breasts, so
Yeah.
you can say that.
So there's a possibly there might be just one female here.
Yeah.
So how did evolution happen?
There is one in the middle.
Yeah, there might be. I think the artist went, oh God, no women. I suppose I'm going to put one, draw breasts on one of them.
If you read Evelyn Reed, Women's Evolution,
Yeah.
this is contrast to what she says. In that.
Evelyn Reed. Yeah.
Evelyn Reed is my favorite lady.
Oh, good for you.
She educated me.
Did she?
Of course she has. Thanks to her.
That's great. Anything else? So we've got evolution without females, possibly. What else is going on here?
There's definitely a strict technological ordering, right? It's
Yeah.
superior one way.
And? Yes, Siri.
So I mean, I kind of suggested, I don't know, maybe not everybody thought that, but that in the last one on the right, we don't know who's inside, but we assume it's a guy.
You have, exactly. So you don't know who the space person is. What's the likelihood that there's a female body in there?
Nil.
Nil. Right.
How many female astronauts has it in
No, there's been loads. Yeah, I've got actually. Yeah, no. As part of a book series that I edit, actually, one of the other editors is currently working on a book, which is about that very subject. And I'm not surprised that you don't know, because it's been a subject's been incredibly neglected. This will be one of the first books on the subject, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. So okay, so you know, presumably the human race is going to go off into space and, I don't know, repopulate another planet when we've destroyed this one. Only men will do it on their own. Yeah. Anything else going on here?
Well, we noticed that the last two are clothed, so they're covering their natural bodies.
Yeah.
Especially the one before the last.
So what is that telling you? What's happening gradually, apart from the change in the, you know, we did say week before last evolution was about change, but this is telling you something else.
Alienation.
Sorry?
Alienation from nature.
Alienation from nature. Yeah, I've developed that a bit.
But it's self-awareness, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the sort of biblical thing, isn't it? Yeah. What else?
Also, westernizing.
Yeah. Keep going.
Well, it's evolving to become a white man.
Yeah. Well, it's evolving into white Western culture. So it's race. It's essentially racist. Yeah. It's that there are various iterations of the human. You know, you can imagine in the gaps that you know a racist artist could easily fill in the gaps there. And you know, the other thing is that we read this from left to right, and not all cultures read from left to right. And this is a very persistent image. This is a fairly recent one. I found it on the internet. But I don't know who the artist was that did the original one, but it keeps getting reiterated over and over and over again, always with the same kind of assumptions that the human is a white male, and you know that other races and females fit very awkwardly into that chain of associations that development, supposedly. Whereas, you know, even for Darwin, evolution was about change. It wasn't necessarily about something called progress, with an assumption that we knew where progress was going. But this image is completely alien to that. This is about a particular form of development, a particular hierarchy, where race is implied as a hierarchy, as is gender. Okay, so not an innocent...
Totally deceptive.
Yeah, totally.
Of reality.
Yeah, totally. Okay, thank you for that. So, we have a politics of the maternal body, because evolution is all about, you know, when you think about evolution in terms of progress, if you think about it in terms of a hierarchy of development, what you're really thinking about is the right kind of babies being born into the right environment in order to thrive. And how do you ensure that? Well, you make sure that women's bodies are policed, that they are controlled. So we do have a politics of the maternal body. Thinking about the contemporary cultures that we live in then, the maternal body is about biological reproduction, yes, we know that, but also social reproduction. So it is reproduction of social structures as well as reproduction of the right kinds of babies. So you produce the right kind of children in order to maintain hierarchical social structures. This is why the royal kids, you know, marry people that look right and act right and agree. I guess they must. I assume they sign some sort of agreement. That they're going to bring up kids in a particular way in order that they remain aristocratic, something like that. Who the hell knows? Okay. All marriages are arranged. All marriages are arranged because they take place within a whole set of discourses that constrains your choice. And if you think otherwise, we'll have an argument about it. But believe me, all marriages are arranged. So it's about biological reproduction, but it's also about social reproduction. Child rearing practices. There's a massive amount of literature about this. If you're interested, there's a woman called Dorothy Dinnerstein. I think she was one of the first to actually politicise the idea of child rearing practices. It's assumed, the discourse of motherhood, the discourse of the maternal body is that it kind of, that women are naturally maternal, that giving birth is something that we do without any problem because that's what our bodies are all about, and that therefore we are sick, ill, some deranged, subnormal in some way if we don't give birth naturally, if we make a big fuss about it. And it's also assumed that there is some sort of natural inclination towards rearing children. But of course, child rearing practice, and particularly now, there is a huge amount of literature around, a huge amount of the culture is putting pressure on mothers particularly around nutrition and schooling. And the schools, I can't believe, I don't have any children, I can't believe what the schools do. They send robot voices to tell you your child was late for school. And yeah, thanks, Sherry. Mad things like that. It's a complete policing of the maternal function to ensure that, in the contemporary cultures, it's of course to ensure, that the children are brought up as the right kind of fodder for the neoliberal capitalist machine. The discourse of child rearing, the medicalisation of child rearing, and the medicalisation of the maternal body produces the idea of good and bad mothers, and you are never a good enough mother. And this mothers police each other, and they are policed by institutions, and no mothers are ever good enough. Mothers are always guilty. Mothers are always held to account for what goes wrong, because that gives a very nice segue into, well, okay, these mothers are so bad that we have to put in place mechanisms for policing them, and we need to police these mothers' bodies right from the time that they conceive the child. through the child's growing up. The maternal body is both biological and technological, and what I mean by that is that there is a kind of assumption that, particularly in discourses about natural childbirth, there is such a thing. There isn't. There's no such thing as natural childbirth. In fact, the idea of what is natural changes constantly. And always there is some sort of technological assistance. And that technological assistance might be something as simple as, although it's not really simple, it's quite complicated, contraception. The point at which contraception has been stopped to enable a body to give birth. The use of contraception to stop bodies giving birth. This is a technology. Contraception is a technology. It is a technique. It is developed by scientists. And this is a technique applied to the body which either prevents it giving birth or persuades it to give birth or is stopped just at the right time. It, as a lot of women feel that they're ready. Yeah, well, that's another thing. That's all about all marriages being arranged. Well, yeah, all births are arranged as well, because there's a great deal of discourse which purports to be medical about, was it the biological clock? Oh my God. Yeah, that's fairly recent. I mean, I only remember hearing about that towards the end of the 20th century. Prior to that, all the discourse was about stopping giving birth. And then suddenly there's a new discourse which is affecting women, which is about, oh, well, if you don't give birth before your biological clock runs out or stops ticking or whatever the hell it's supposed to do, you're another sort of bad mother. So that the maternal body is always both biological and technological. And as you'll see, there's a feminist called Shulamith Firestone, who I've got a slide about in part 2, who during the 20th century suggested, well, it should be totally technological. What are we doing, still giving birth in pain? We'll see. And then there's a big question about who owns the maternal body. And this is where, economics is very much a part of it. As I said, all marriage is arranged. All marriages have an economic foundation. In very simple terms, it was at one time, is not so much now, obviously, about women not being educated sufficiently and the whole discourse of femininity being such that women were not thought capable of taking on any paid work, or certainly only certain kinds of paid work, and were therefore in need of being owned in order that they could fulfill their function of giving birth. So marriage is actually really about ownership of women's bodies by men. This is what patriarchy is all about. This is the fundamental basis of patriarchy. And the myth of romance then comes in to make it palatable, to make it seem okay. So who owns the maternal body? Well, very often it's the patriarch. And the patriarch doesn't have to be a specific man. It doesn't have to be a person that a woman is married to. It is the patriarchy in general, the whole system, which is patriarchy, which is structured towards the ownership of female bodies and therefore the reproduction of the, in quotes, right sort of children. And the female body is policed in very specific ways, but the way in which it has been policed for centuries is in terms of these limited feminine archetypes, which are both of the body, the virgin and the whore. And this has been going on for centuries. And it's still going on. I'm a slut, quite happy to admit it. I don't do actually I've got a cleaner these days, but I really hate housework. The original definition, the way the word was originally used for a woman that didn't do her cleaning. For a woman that, it was suspected that her household was dirty because, hey, she was off having sex with other men. Okay. So, yeah, I'm quite happy to admit I'm a slut in all sorts of ways, actually. I'm very proud of it. So, I would rather be a whore than a virgin. Thank you very much. But the virgin is even more damaging. The virgin archetype for women is incredibly damaging because it puts women on a pedestal that they can easily fall off of. And this has happened. This is what we do with celebrities constantly. we constantly build, particularly female celebrities, up, put them on a pedestal, ensure that they are thought of as some sort of angel, and then we can knock them down again. The whole culture gets involved in this. It's not a specifically male on female thing, okay? It is a way that women's bodies are policed. You do it to celebrities, then other women start looking at themselves and wondering if they're going to fall off their pedestal at some point. And we'll see how psychoanalysis actually tells us how this gets worked through in the masculine psyche. So, yeah. Okay, just 2 more slides, then we'll go for a break. I started talking week before last about psychoanalytic discourse. It's actually, it's important. It's important for a great many reasons. As I said then, psychoanalysis is not just a clinical practice. It's not just about a technique to alleviate mental health problems of various sorts, but not all sorts, obviously. It is an understanding of how the psyche, the human psyche, is structured, which begins with, well, it doesn't strictly speaking begin with Freud, but certainly Freud he presented the ideas in such a way that it became part of the discourse about the development of the personality. Okay, so from the mid-20th century, with Sigmund Freud, develops a discourse that everybody starts using about the development of the personality. It's fundamentally important because it is part of our culture, whether you like it or not. Okay, we use this discourse every time we talk about ourselves. When you say I, and you say something, you confess something about it. And we do this all the time. It's what social media is all about. It's all about telling people who you are over and over and over again, confessing the self, as Foucault says, constantly. Saying, this is me, this is what I do, this is what I like. Aren't I funny? Or, aren't I sad? Or etc. Constantly confessing. Very much the way that psychoanalysis works to force you to confess the self. We do that to each other in our social interactions. And psychoanalytic discourse is always founded in gendered assumptions. So it's always founded in the assumption that the feminine is passive and the masculine is active. And as I pointed out week before last, this is very much in Freudian psychoanalysis. And Freud reproduces the assumptions of his time and just, comes up with some very weird shit about women's bodies, about women's sexuality. He thinks that we kind of give up masturbation when we're children because, his big thing was children masturbate. Shock horror. Everybody got really freaked out when Freud said that. And, he was very unpopular for a long time. But he said, little boys don't stop. In fact, they get so attached to their penises that it's quite difficult to drag them away from it. But little girls, apparently, at some point noticed that little boys have penises, that the little boy's genital is bigger than ours. How we got that idea, I'm not sure. And so we give up masturbation until we can have a penis of our own, by getting a man. I mean, that's a very short version of Freud's description of the feminine personality, but that nevertheless is kind of what he said. So he therefore proves, in quotes, scientifically that women, and therefore the feminine, is a passive position, waiting for the penis to come and save them and give them a baby, and that the masculine is always active. And this is partly what produces the idea of the bad mother and the absent father, both raced and classed. Because if you do not conform to that active-passive stereotype, that very often is at the basis of the way that people are policed and the way that they are dissed through, particularly you think of the tabloid press. You look at any tabloid that is dissing particularly working class people or black people for the way that they raise children or whatever. It's about bad mothers, So it's about mothers not being sufficiently passive and feminine and staying in the home and taking care of the children. And it's about fathers being absent, therefore not being an active part of the child's lives. It's always there. It's always implied. This dichotomy never ever goes away. Also, the other thing that psychoanalytic discourse does is it secures the idea of mental health as founded in sexual function. This is why we're always confessing about our sexuality. This is why, the social media comes along just at the time when the culture desperately needs it because we want to tell everybody about our sexuality. Lack of sexual appetite is seen as a disorder, and I put there asexuality question mark because that's another sort of little glimmer of hope at the moment that people are starting to identify as asexual. And the point I wanted to get to is that psychoanalytic discourse, of course, perpetuates this whole virgin whore dichotomy on the basis of unnatural appetites. So because we have absorbed psychoanalytic discourse, because we reproduce it in our posts on social media and in our conversations, we are constantly, every time we open our mouths to say something, reproducing the idea of unnatural appetites because we're confessing ourselves as either confessing, oh, I'm so normal, or confessing, look at me, I'm so weird. But whatever we're doing, we are constantly through our utterances, as the linguistic philosophers call them, the things we say, we are reproducing these dichotomies. So it also establishes the distinction between civilized and uncivilized as founded in sexual continence. So the other thing that we're constantly saying to each other is like, I'm so civilized, okay? Because, hey, look, I just got married. That tells everybody everything. Look at me being terribly civilized. I'm not like, the people that have no control over their sexuality. I'm happy to control my sexuality within the institution of marriage. You might have gathered I hate marriage a lot. I'm a radical feminist. What do you expect?
Can I ask, when you say, when you say all marriages are arranged,
Yeah.
do you refer to mating as well, or becoming?
No. The institution of marriage. I mean, you can do whatever you do outside marriage. In a way, that's arranged as well because there's so much cultural pressure. You can't really separate the kind of sanctioned relationships that people have from the supposedly unsanctioned ones.
So what makes marriage different to that?
It's a form of first of all, it's sanctioned under the law. So the marriage is actually saying, it's the law saying to you, yeah, okay, here you are, you have the legal right to procreate. But who you choose to marry, you think you have choice, but actually you don't. Who you choose is determined by all sorts of things: social class, what Pierre Bourdieu writes about, which is taste, educational levels, all sorts of things, police, who you are likely to meet, and then who you are likely to end up with.
Saying, then that applies to who you are going to be.
Oh, more than likely. Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean, but then I see what you mean. So if you have a partner, you're not actually married, it still applies. Yeah, it certainly does. So the idea of marriage, I mean, you may not have gone through the ceremony, but the institution and the way that it structures how you're supposed to live, how it structures social lives, is still lurking there somewhere. But yeah, good point. Thank you.
Monopolizing of woman's life.
Yeah.
Shortly.
Yeah.
That's all there is. It doesn't matter by whom, by what, where, when. It's all works,
Yeah, for sure.
Subjugate women to slavery.
Yeah. So subjugate the womb to slavery.
Tragedy of humanity.
Well, it's all about reproducing a particular form of human, isn't it?
It's not a human anymore. Women are not considered as a human because they bore children. That's what Simone de Beauvoir said.
Yeah, we're coming to Simone de Beauvoir in after the break. Can you wait? One final slide before the break. So before we go on to look at some feminist theorists, the politics of gender. These are the questions that are always asked. So who owns the maternal body? That's the big one. Which bodies perform the most valued labour? There's always, Marxism has, is always there lurking, always in fact, I keep going on about this woman, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I'm not going to talk about her. I wasn't going to talk about her tonight. She's one of my favourite feminists from the early 20th century, American woman. And she wrote a book called Women in Economics, which is absolutely brilliant. And it really just asks that question, which bodies perform the most valued labour? And she goes through all the ways that if women didn't do what they did, then everything would break down.
It is women actually, because in Africa, in Asia and Latin America, women all do all the field work.
Yeah.
Women are more creative than men. Men sits in the cafes and they talk about politics, and the women go to the field. If they don't go to the field, if they don't go to the field,
Latin American. Yeah.
Latin American.
Someone's asking you, are you Latin American?
It's irrelevant where I am coming from, America.
The lady behind you wants to talk to you.
I'm asking you, the Latin American, where you know how men and women are organized in Latin America.
No, it's not that. It is. I've been
No, it is,
educated.
because
I've
it's
been
the
educated by
Latin American
Sheer Height, Kate Millett, Simone de Beauvoir, and the rest of the feminist movement.
Oh, okay, can we postpone this discussion till later? Not sure what's going on back there because I can't hear you properly. Okay, so these are the questions that you can...
Thank you for shutting me fucking off.
Yeah. So these are the questions we're going to take into the break. So economic, as I've said, whose bodies are the most valuable resource for capital? Social, so how does the law differentiate between genders? Of course it does. How does education affect how we identify as gendered persons? That's a massive one. So that, even if you feel that you are beyond gender, even if you feel that gender is no longer a category that is functioning as it did, and it is certainly beginning to break down, the education system thinks otherwise. The education system still thinks in terms of gendered bodies. How do families enforce gender conformity? Well, there again, it's, in fact, that robot voice from the school. I mean, what mother is going to, have the time and the energy to tell the robot voice to fuck off because she's going to bring up her kids the way she wants to? And how does religion determine gender roles? And even if you're an atheist, religion, the discourse of religion still lurks within the utterances, within all the discourse, with everything that you say when you open your mouth. There's still religious discourse is still there determining gender roles. And of course cultural. So we're doing cultural studies. It's there in fashion, in film and TV, in sport, music, literature, definitely dating, and definitely gaming. We won't go there for the moment, but if any gamers out there, think about it. Okay, so 10 minutes for a cigarette break, get a pizza, whatever, and then we'll do some famous feminists. We're going to have a punch up.
I was trying to avoid that.
Just to prove to you that feminism has been around since at least the early 16th century, this is one of the illustrations from a book by a woman called Christine de Pizan. It's called The Book of the City of the Ladies. And I love this illustration. Of course, it's pre-perspective. It's pre-Renaissance, and it's. But what you've got there on the left is that's Christine herself, and she's reading, and she's approached by these three. I don't know, they're sort of angels or whatever they are. I can't remember what they're called. One of them's Reason. Reason is the most interesting. The other one's called Rectitude, and the other one's Justice, as far as I remember. Okay, so they come to her and they ask questions about the assumptions that are made about women. She wrote the book because she got very upset about the religious text she was reading, and the men that had analysed the biblical texts and determined that women were just a bloody nuisance. I mean, that's pretty much what she says. And so she wanted to rectify that, to put it right. And so she writes this book of the City of the Ladies. And I love this bit of the illustration on the right here. Look, she hasn't bothered to change her clothes. She hasn't put on any overalls, and she's got a trowel, and she's building a wall while one of her muses, or whatever they are, humours, I think they're called, is helping her with the bricks. And the City of the Ladies is a metaphor. It's a huge metaphor for building something that is essentially amounts to a very early form of feminism. And she talks about sort of when they dig out the earth and carrying the clods of earth away, they're carrying away the sort of the burden of women hatred. So, I mean, although, obviously she's not that progressive, she's certainly very interesting, and you can get the Kindle edition for $2.99. It's a bit difficult to read. Obviously, it's a translation, and it's very, very old, and some of the terms are obscure, but it's certainly worth having a look at. Anyway, so moving forward. Moving forward a lot to Marxist feminism and Simone de Beauvoir. I'm not going to dwell a great deal on de Beauvoir. I've included her very famous quote there right at the end. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. That's what everybody who studies de Beauvoir knows that she said. And that quote, that idea reverberates through 20th century feminism. The Second Sex, the book that it comes from, was published in 1949. There's a lot going on in Europe, obviously. This is just post-Second World War. There's a lot of questions being asked. Because, one of the big question, of course, is how on earth did it happen? How on earth could we let it happen? And there's a very interesting book by a man called Klaus Tuerleit. And in fact, I sometimes read Klaus Tuerleit and I think he's possibly more of a feminist than some of the feminist writers. And it's called Male Fantasies, and it really analyses women hatred in the Nazi psyche. And he pretty much comes to the conclusion, it comes to several conclusions, it's 2 volumes long, but one of the conclusions he comes to is that Nazism, fascism in itself, grows out of, it has its roots in dread of and hatred of women. And you'll see that there's this is why I wanted to remind you about psychoanalysis, why psychoanalysis is important. Because the mere fact that we have ideas from psychoanalysis allows those sort of analyses to be made. And it's a very, very interesting analysis. So de Beauvoir then. So, yeah, I'm not going to read through all the quotes, but she's fascinating. She says, it would appear then that every female human being is not necessarily a woman. To be so considered, she must share in that mysterious and threatened reality known as femininity. So that, what she's pointing out in 1949 is that there is a cultural element to gender. That gender, she's actually asserting that gender exists, gender being the culturally determined version of the sexes. So, that the sexes are divided into 2, and that those 2 sexes have culturally determined roles to play, and that somehow, you're not a woman unless you exhibit femininity. The other, she says, humanity is male, and man defines woman not as herself, but as relative to him. She's not regarded as an autonomous being. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. Again, something that reverberates through feminist analysis right through the 20th and into the 21st century. Remember, we talked about subjectivity, that this is the possessed self. The subject is, you are all subjects. You are all persons, and as such are subjects, and you are determined as subjects by the culture that you live in. So how you act out your subjectivity is determined by the kinds of discourses that you're surrounded by because of your cultural location. And woman exists, as several feminists have said, to reflect man at twice his size. I mean, I don't know if that was de Beauvoir, but certainly several feminists have said that in various versions. What I'm finding interesting about that final quote is that something I've found in reading feminist theory throughout the 20th century is that intersectionality keeps emerging, that it didn't need Kimberly Crenshaw to tell us about it, that a lot of the feminists had noted, it's already been noted, that race, class and gender are inseparable and intersectional. And this is where de Beauvoir talks about race, and she says there are deep similarities between the situation of women and that of the Negro. That was a term that they used in those days. Both are being emancipated today from a like paternalism, and the former master class wishes to keep them in their place. So, she's talking about the Second World War when, out of necessity, women went to work because the men were all off fighting, basically. And there's a lot of testimony from the 1940s in this country, the United States and France, from women who found a huge amount of emancipation, unfortunately, through war, because they were able then to actually find that they had skills that they didn't realise that they had, and they earned their own money, and suddenly life changed quite dramatically. The war comes to an end. Cut a long story short, there's massive campaigns to get women back into the home so that men can have their jobs back. One of the campaigns, and I was talking to Shiri about the Feminist Library earlier, some research that I did years ago in the Feminist Libraries. They have a lot of material from newspapers around the time The Second Sex was published, which was aimed at women, asking them, tell us what gadgets you'd like and we'll produce them. Any gadgets you want, okay? We'll just imagine what sort of gadget would make your housework easier. And so they came up with all these amazing ideas, and of course, the companies that made domestic appliances had been making armaments. It was dead easy. Switch to domestic appliances, sell them to women. They'll go back to the home, and then, this was so clever. And by the way, you've got all these domestic appliances now. You don't really have to work hard at your housework. So bloody well put on some makeup. Okay, this is what the advertising does. If you look at the advertising from just after the Second World War, right through the end of the 20th century, this is exactly what is happening. Femininity then is getting redefined, my point here is. And Simone de Beauvoir shows us that it gets redefined in the same way as race gets redefined constantly in order to keep bodies policed. She says to keep them in their place, the place chosen for them. In both cases, the former masters lavish more or less sincere eulogies, either on the virtues of the good Negro with his dormant, childish, merry soul, the submissive Negro, or the merits of the woman who is truly feminine. I think we still hear that. That is, frivolous, infantile, irresponsible, submissive woman. In both bases, the dominant class bases its argument on a state of affairs that it itself has created. So she starts that, set of ideas about the construction of feminine identity and masculine identity. There's not much wrong with Simone de Beauvoir. One of the things that there are things that she doesn't address. She's a Marxist, but the point about Marxism is that the proletariat, when they realise their oppression, will rise up, seize the means of production, and abolish themselves as a class. Of course, this is what is essential in Marxism, that the working class will work to abolish themselves. After the revolution, there will be no working class. Make sense? De Beauvoir balks at women abolishing themselves as a class. How can we abolish ourselves? She's kind of saying. Okay, she doesn't go far enough. Someone else does. Shulamith Firestone, I love this woman. She had a really, really hard life. She's American, Jewish, suffered from mental health problems, committed suicide. She was, in her time, a kind of niche feminist that people didn't take that much notice of. She had a moment in the 1970s, but, then people stopped talking about her. She is being revived now quite significantly because I think she was well ahead of her time. She basically starts by developing Friedrich Engels' observation that the nuclear family reproduces the structure of class. Engels is a sort of proto-feminist. It's quite interesting reading Engels. But he's a kind of scientist. So he's making an analysis of the society that he sees as oppressive to the working class. And he sees the patriarchy in the nuclear family. He doesn't really care about women. Okay. He's looking at the family as kind of reproducing class structures in miniature. It's very clever. I mean, it's fantastic, actually. And Firestone kind of goes back to Engels and says, we can see this, definitely. And then she says, just as to assure elimination of economic classes requires the revolt of the underclass, the proletariat, and in a temporary dictatorship, their seizure of the means of production. So to ensure the elimination of sexual classes requires the revolt of the underclass, women, and the seizure of the control of reproduction. She doesn't just mean contraception. She means pretty much what she says in her book is why, science is, we've gone to the moon. By the time she's published The Dialectic of Sex, NASA has landed people on the moon. And she says, we can do that, but women still give birth. Why? We've made biological birth part of femininity. If men were to go into labour, if men had to go into labour, carry children for 9 months and go into labour, they would have invented the technology to produce. They would have invented artificial wombs. And people kind of laughed at her a bit at the time, but of course now it's becoming and even if the technology is either not possible or not wanted, the mere fact that she thought it, that she put it out there as an idea, forces us to consider how femininity and the birth of children are connected, and how we naturalise the idea of childbirth. We naturalise the idea of women being slaves, in effect, to our wombs. And that's still, the whole idea of the biological clock is about slavery to the womb, to just one part of our biology, to just one little bit of what we are. So the mere fact that she can suggest that quite possibly what's wrong with artificial wombs actually opens up that debate. Yes, Shiri.
Because there is the kind of almost full circle with the kind of delegation of pregnancy to surrogate women who are again sort of an underclass.
Yeah.
And that's,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean that there's some pretty horrible things going on now. That actually when you think about it, yes, why has nobody actually thought about an artificial womb? Is it because it will abolish women as a class, and then what happens? Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So another interesting thing that she says is, like sexism in the individual psyche, we can fully understand racism only in terms of the power hierarchies of the family. And again, what she's doing is pointing out that patriarchy in all its forms is not only a macro version of the micro patriarchal structure of the nuclear family, but that this is part of what perpetuates racism as much as what perpetuates sexism. So the argument I was saying earlier about the mere fact that women have wombs is intersectional with racism, because what we produce out of our wombs becomes incredibly important and political. This is what Firestone is working with here in The Dialectic of Sex. It's a fascinating book. I could give a whole lecture about it, but I don't have time. I'm going to have to move on. So, feminist psychoanalysis. Now, I'm going to introduce you to the wonderfully named Karen Horney. Some of you will have heard of her. She was writing in 1932. There's another woman. I very often used to teach them both together. There's another woman called Melanie Klein, who's another feminist psychoanalyst. Perhaps not quite so out there as Horney, but they are working with ideas that only re-emerge much, much later in the 20th century. And Horney's wonderful because she tried to write for everybody. So rather than use the sort of technical language of psychoanalysis to confuse people, she wrote as straightforwardly as she possibly could. And so the language is a bit archaic and a bit weird, but I quite like it. She was German, so this is obviously in translation. She writes more. Her book, she wrote a lot of essays, and they get published as a book called Feminine Psychology, which is kind of a wrong title, because a lot of it's about masculinity and not about femininity. But of course, if you're writing about masculinity, you have to be writing about femininity. And this is something that she says about male attitudes to women. She says, the attitude of love and adoration signifies, the man saying to himself, there is no need for me to dread a being so wonderful, so beautiful, so saintly. And that of disparagement implies it would be too ridiculous to dread a creature who, if you take her all round, is such a poor thing. This is the virgin-whore dichotomy, okay? The dread of women, as far as Horney is concerned, is she rejigs Freud, and she asks some very pertinent questions. I mean, Freud, was obsessed with size. I mean, he was a bloke, but he had this idea that, this idea of women giving up masturbation because their genital isn't large enough, and therefore thinking that the boy must get greater pleasure, is somewhat ridiculous. So, size becomes all important. There is in Freud certainly a dread of women, and Karen Horney kind of picks it up and runs with it, that essentially little boys are very worried about losing their penises. Remember when I talked about psychoanalysis a couple of weeks ago, I said that for Freud, the castration complex is incredibly important, because the little boy learns that there is such a thing in the world as people that don't have penises, and it terrifies him because he has, at this point discovered that it's part of his own body from which he gets a great deal of pleasure. As much or more pleasure than he got from suckling at the breast. And this is a body part, unlike the breast, that doesn't go away, it's attached to him. But the fear is the castration complex comes in because, oh my God, what if it becomes detached? And what if this man with a larger penis, Dad, who I want to grow into, who I want to be like, comes and cuts it off because I've been naughty. And that's apparently, this, according to Freud, this is what little boys, how they grow up. Because what happens is they're so terrified of losing their penises that they conform. They become good masculine little men to grow up and have a large penis that never got cut off like Dad. But the fear is always there. And the dread of woman comes from this. The dread of being like a woman. The dread of being castrated. And Karen Horney went into a playground, and this is one of the most fascinating essays she wrote. She took a football, in the days when, 1930s, no plastic, leather footballs. And it's a deflated leather football, and she's cut a slit in it, okay? And she takes it into the playground, and there's sweets inside it. And she says to the little girls, do you want to put your hand in and get some sweets out? And the little girls plunge their hand in and get all the sweets. She takes it into the boys' playground, and they won't do it. And this is one of the experiments that she does, that she says that there is a fear of the wound, that woman represents a wound, women bleed, hello, and that this dread follows men, determines the development of masculinity. So that the man has to compensate, she says, for the dread of women in his psyche, and the compensation is the virgin whore dichotomy. She doesn't use those terms. This is how she writes it. Okay? And it kind of makes sense. If you've read psychoanalysis, you think, yeah, okay, fair enough. I'm not really going to argue with that. You may want to, but nevertheless, I think she's incredibly important as far as, she's little known now. Melanie Klein is better known. I think she's very important as far as the relationship between feminism and psychoanalysis is concerned. And someone that some of you will almost definitely have heard of is much later is Judith Butler, who wrote this book, Gender Trouble, in 1990. It's incredibly famous. I'm got a slide in a minute where I'm going to talk to you about Lacanian psychoanalysis, because this is what Judith Butler uses. This lecture is heavy on psychoanalysis. I am not a psychoanalytic theorist, but I have discovered in studying feminist theory that psychoanalysis is a massive, massive part of it. So I think in order to understand feminist theory, you've kind of got to go there. Marxism and psychoanalysis, the two major discourses of the 20th century, it's hardly surprising that they've informed feminist ideas. And it helps to understand them just a little bit, if you can understand these sort of well-known feminists that contributed to the discourse that we use now. So, Gender Trouble. Judith Butler, she's a Lacanian. I've got a slide in a minute when I'll talk about Lacanian psychoanalysis. These are the famous things. Actually, the one of the most famous is the one that I've put there at the bottom. She says, discrete genders are part of what humanises individuals within contemporary culture. Indeed, we regularly punish those who fail to do their gender right. Boy, do we. Okay? We punish people in all sorts of ways who do not perform as expected. And look at that, the first quote there from her. The performance of drag, she said, she is talking literally about drag. The performance of drag, and she talks quite a lot about drag and cross-dressing because it is a performance. And she said the performance of drag plays upon the distinction between the anatomy of the performer and the gender that is being performed. And this is she puts this in italics. In imitating gender, drag implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself as well as its contingency. And what she's saying there is that we perform our gender constantly. There's two ways that she uses the term performance. Performance is used in the linguistic philosophy to talk about the way that utterances, the things that we say, produce the world around us. Think about it, okay? We produce the world around us. We produce ourselves and the rest of the world every time we open our mouths and state that something is the truth. We're in a very interesting period for that sort of thing at the moment, because the performances around us tend to be producing an alter truth that there is a contest over. There's a massive contest over at the moment. An interesting time, very dangerous time as well. And so performance she's using in two ways. First of all, it's about utterances. It's about the performance of language. Secondly, she's talking about literally drag and cross-dressing, the way that if gender was something essential to the person, then we wouldn't have such a thing as drag and cross-dressing. If you were essentially a feminine person, if it was something that was a part of your anatomy that was deep inside you, then you wouldn't have to perform your gender constantly. Think about that for a minute. And something that I've always been impressed with Judith Butler is the way that she relates gender to how the human is constructed. And as I say, I'll come to posthumanism right at the end. And the way that she puts humanizes there in quotes, and she says that, you know, we fail to be human, in other words, unless we agree, and it is an agreement, to perform a specific gender. And when she talks about the contingency of gender, what she's saying is that gender changes historically. So we're right back to the first slide when I talked about femininity and masculinity being historical, being not the same in all cultures and in all historical periods. They are therefore contingent. They're dependent on specific discourses that circulate and dependent on, as I said before, economics and politics. We all right so far? Okay, I promised you some Lacanian psychoanalysis. Get prepared for this. Okay, I have referred to this before. I have talked about the Mirror's Stage and Jacques Lacan. In fact, I did introduce you to him. He was an arsehole, so we won't talk about him. But he actually developed Freudian theory in some very interesting ways. Basically what he does is he enables us to think about the development of the psyche in terms of the development of culture. Freud, although it's implied in Freud that, and of course, you know, as I've said before, what Freud's interested in is how people get civilized. And they get civilized in a cultural context. You know, civilization is contingent as well. But Lacan takes it further, and he associates the development of the psyche with the development of language. So I've tried, it's incredibly complex stuff. I've tried to simplify it. I hope I haven't oversimplified it. Basically, he says when children enter the mirror stage, they first of all realise that they are individuals with bodily boundaries, and second, are driven by desire to communicate with others. The mirror stage for Lacan is incredibly important. This is when, those of you that have children, you'll know that if you carry a child around and they see themselves in the mirror, they get kind of excited. Lacan was, he was at the zoo and he was watching like gorillas, and they could see themselves in the mirror, but they didn't find it particularly exciting. It was kind of like, so what, that's me. Human children get very excited and they like to be able to identify themselves. And what he says is, and I can't prove this, I've never had children, but apparently, shortly after the child begins to recognise itself in the mirror, it begins to develop language incredibly fast. And the reason for this, he says, is that children don't have bodily boundaries. In fact, in both Freud and Lacan, being a child is awful. And if you get out of it, you're really lucky. If you get out of it unscathed, and I think most of us don't, you would be incredibly lucky, because Lacanian childhood is horrendous. It's basically because you don't have a boundary between yourself and your parent. Part of you keeps disappearing. And this is particularly true of the mother. And of course, they're obsessed with the breast. So we'll stick with that for the moment. So the most satisfying part of you, which it's actually your mother, keeps going away, and you have to bring her back. And according to Lacan, this is awful for the child. It suffers a great deal of anxiety. And so its moments of satisfaction are outweighed by its incredibly long periods of intense anxiety. And so when it starts to recognise that, actually, hang on a sec, there are boundaries around a bit of me, and I'm somewhat separate from this person. There's another person there. It begins to get an inkling of it. It gets sneaky. It wants to learn techniques to bring mother back, to bring the breast back, to bring back the source of satisfaction. At this stage, and this is really, really important, this is what they enter what Lacan calls the symbolic order. And this is the world understood through language, which is governed by what he calls the law of the father. Okay? The law of the father. Because language is patriarchal. And he's no feminist, Lacan, but he says this as a scientist. Language is patriarchal. If, as other theorists we've met in this lecture today are correct, and I think they probably are, that the family, the patriarchal family, is the micro version of the state, which is, it's a miniature version of the patriarchal state. Then the law of the father, language develops within that context, and learning language means learning difference. This is the major thing about language. The baby has identified itself as different from its parent. So it's learned one form of difference. It's identified itself, according to Freud, as different from the other gender. So either possessing a penis or not possessing a penis, 0 and 1, okay? Negative and positive. It's learning difference, and then it learns language. And language, as we learned in our first lecture, means only negatively in terms of what it is not. Do you see where we're going here? Do you see what Lacan's doing? It's that your personality is given to you in language, and the language represents the culture. It's complex stuff, but it's also kind of fascinating. So the first recognition of the self in the mirror relieves anxiety about the inability to control the body. And this is the perfect self. So, this is so relevant to selfie culture. So according to Lacan, the first glimpse of a controlled self in the mirror, a body that actually has boundaries, is the ego ideal. This is what you want to be, perfectly controlled. And of course, you're perfectly, and of course it's all to do with pissing and shitting as well, because the baby at this point is also, learning self-control. This is all part of being civilized. So you're learning your bodily boundaries. You're learning to sort of close up the orifices of your body, but you're also learning that the perfect self is the perfectly civilized self. Remember what Judith Butler says about discrete genders humanizing people? This is where she's coming from. She's a Lacanian. Okay? So discrete genders tell us that we're human and how to behave as humans. And the mirror self, says Lacan, is absolutely necessary to normal functioning. Looking at yourself in the mirror as a child and seeing your body under control, it's like if you take a baby in front of a mirror and it waves and the baby in the mirror waves back, it kind of recognises that it has some control. This is its first recognition of being in control, not necessarily of itself. It probably thinks the baby in the mirror is a separate baby, but it's controlling something. Something is happening to its body and it's mirrored over there. And this is another reason why it's the ego ideal. What Lacan says, you can't carry mirrors with you all the time, although we do now. People have phones. I'm sure this is what it's about. And Lacan said, what you do is you replace the mirror with other people. Other people reflect you, your ego ideal. You've got language. So, you meet someone in the street, they say, hi, how are you? You look great. There you have your mirror. People just, yes.
Did Lacan have a theory for how people developed this mirror stage before they had mirrors?
We've always had mirrors. We've had water. Yeah. There's always been something. I mean, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster. I mean, the monster is totally Lacanian because, he identifies as ugly the moment he looks at himself in a pool. So he's quite sweet. If you've ever read Frankenstein, the monster's an absolute darling until he catches sight of himself in a pool. And because he's then gained some cultural knowledge, because he's been out in the world a bit, because he ran away from the lab, he just looks at himself and goes, oh my God, I'm ugly. So I'll just act out. I will perform my ugliness, and that's when he starts killing people. Yeah, anyway, so that was a bit of a transgression. So, yeah, language works through binary oppositions. I think we've said that. And the oppositions are hierarchical, so there is always one privileged term. So we identify ourselves according to these hierarchical structures, and I've just sort of listed some common hierarchical structures there. So it's almost like we can't escape it. That's the problem with Lacan. You enter into language, you're entering into a hierarchy where yourself is reflected back constantly as one term of the hierarchy. So it's kind of uncomfortable and horrible. But some of these feminists like Judith Butler have taken Lacan, run with him, and actually said, well, actually there are ways out of this. And this is why she talks about gender performance. Okay, we're going to run over time a little bit. I'll be as quick as I can. Another one I don't know whether any of you will have heard of, but I think she's also incredibly important, Laura Mulvey, and this essay that she wrote in 1975 called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. She is responsible for introducing the concept of the male gaze. And again, you know, we're back with psychoanalysis. And again, we're back with social media. And she points out that the feminine woman is fetishized. And here we're back with the virgin whore dichotomy. For the male viewer, says Mulvey, the woman is guilty and in need of punishment. The reason she's guilty is because she's lost her penis. So if you believe Freud, what Freud said is that the woman has been punished or will be punished. So there's according to Freud, little boys have a really hard time actually because they've got to overcome this problem with mother, that either she's been punished and has lost her penis, or she can be idealized into not having lost it. So, according to Freud, fetishes, things like high heels, replace the penis, or the whole woman come to stand in for the missing penis. It gets a little bit over the top at this point, but because Mulvey makes use of it, it's worth pointing out. And the camera, says Mulvey, is like a peeping Tom. It spies on the woman without her knowledge. And the presence of the camera, it becomes a technology, and I think Mulvey's important because of, she's pointing out that gender is always technologized. And as I said earlier, the politics of the maternal body is always technologized, and gender is always technologized. The mirror is a technology. The camera is, of course, a technology that's akin to the mirror. It's scopophilic. It's a technology of viewing. It's a technology which determines the ego ideal. So the male viewer, she says, is placed in direct voyeuristic relationship with the female star, and the male protagonists stand in for the viewer, which is the ego ideal. So that's great. So why on earth do women enjoy cinema? This was the big question that Mulvey didn't answer. Okay, so she said something about women are identifying with the female lead. She didn't say enough, okay. Nevertheless, there was a certain amount of sense in this idea, and it's still, sure.
Are we socialized to also identify with the male, like peeping Tom, as women?
Exactly. That's one of the objections to Mulvey. But then other people have argued that, okay, but yes, we are, because we view ourselves through the male gaze. That femininity is actually a view of the woman through the male gaze, so that it actually does make sense. There's still a huge debate going on about this. Yeah, that's Mulvey's famous quote. I'm not going to read it to you. She comes up with this bizarre and clunky term that women connote to be looked at-ness. So that's what femininity is. It's to be looked at-ness. It's difficult to say. But, again, it has stuck. It's produced a great deal of debate. since you first published it. So, male gaze. It's getting a bit late now. I was going to give you an exercise to do, but do you want to do it? Yeah, I thought you might. Analyse that then. So, okay, so what's going on there? That's my question.
She's like
Disrobing.
disrobing a trash bag. I don't follow this. I don't know these people.
I think that's her.
Is that her defining?
Selling point.
I see.
What do
I
you
see.
call it? Yeah, you can
I see.
selling point.
Yeah, well, but the pearls are like very pointy, right? They're way over the top, like cheeks.
It's the
I guess, like, yeah, it is that. Actually, right? They're kind of looking at over the shoulder, the hair. Yeah, it's sort of rolled up.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit late tonight anyway, but I'll try. I know this is stuff. Sure. Okay. What did you think I want to do? We'll just clear up or something. See you later, Carrie.
Yep, so look, these things. Okay, so why the trash bag? Oh yeah, oh god, the Sean, you're right. She's like...
Okay. So what kind of femininity are we looking at? How is it constructed?
She's an artist.
You reckon?
Yes, she's exposing her body as a form of art.
Tell me more.
That's what they do, you see. Not everybody can do that.
If she was at Burning Man and that was a photo, I'm sure it'd be alright.
That's interesting. You reckon?
Yeah, I think so.
What sort of all right?
Well, I think everyone would think twice about it. If that photo was taken in a desert, she
Yeah.
had some face paint on,
Uh-huh.
and there was a campfire in the background,
Right.
a tambourine on the floor,
Yeah.
it would be fine.
I get what you mean. I get that nudity would be kind of okay at Burning Man, yeah? All right. Different type of nudity?
Not really, she's got her ass out.
Do you think it's like a are you talking about like kind of like we were talking about taste like in previous weeks? It's different taste like.
Of course, personal taste, I mean, the woman, she's already done sex tapes. To her, how she views her body and how her sexuality, she's quite open about it, and that's her personal choice. I just think that it wouldn't be as much of a discussion if I think we wouldn't be having the same discussion if it was, say, wasn't for a magazine cover.
Okay, all right. Let me just ask you. Look closely at that body. Do you look like that?
Yes.
I love you.
We all do. I don't know what's the big deal.
Wait a minute. First of all, yeah.
You said to try and disassociate it from the woman,
Yes.
right, and just think about the technology. So
Yes.
the camera,
Yeah.
I suspect there's a lot of photoshopping in that.
Tons of photoshopping.
There is a very, very narrow waist,
Yep.
very wide hips, which
Yeah.
suggests childbearing ability.
Yep.
Therefore, it's a reinforcement of the perfect female.
Yep. Thank you. Pretty much said it. But let's over there, yeah.
Well, we were just saying here, it could be anybody because of the technique of photographs and what have you.
Uh-huh.
We are led to focus on the body.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't matter who the model is. So anybody could play that.
Oh, absolutely,
Because of
yeah.
the technology and Photoshop or whatever the technique is, we are led to focus on the body.
Yeah.
As well. So it reminds me of the previous person, Mark. What was her name? The cinema.
Laura Marvin?
She said the body to be looked at. How did she define the?
Yeah. To be looked atness, yeah.
This is it. You see, in
Yeah.
that discourse, it
Yeah.
could be anybody who could play that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or it could be. I mean, actually, we're in a really interesting time now because you don't actually need models. An AI can produce something like that quite easily. Yes.
But I would argue that there's
Yeah.
a reason why that doesn't. I mean, I appreciate there's probably like AI porn, I have no idea. But there's a reason why she is known and she's on the cover of this magazine. Like, it's about relating this image to some type of like archetype that you like reference somehow, like in another way.
She's just a contemporary iteration of a particular type that has been replaced by various women. I mean, Marilyn Monroe. She's referencing Marilyn Monroe there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, she's actually referencing Grace Jones, which I mean, we can talk
Yeah.
about how it's even more like
Yes.
ridiculous and
Yeah.
problematic. But I don't know. Like, if this was on the cover of a magazine to just like a porn magazine, no one would care.
Yeah.
Like, I do think there's something different about the fact that we know who this person. We think we know who this person is.
Well, think we know is probably I'm glad you said that. Yeah. She's just doing her job. That's how she makes money.
Yes, commercializing her body. But if you go to south of France, where I've been to nudist beaches, you can see beautiful bodies as she is. Many.
And ugly bodies? And somewhere in between?
Beautiful. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
No, that's Photoshop. It's not a body. Never mind. You enjoy. Yes.
I was thinking the extent of the photoshopping is reminiscent of Saartjie Baartman, who was kidnapped. And
Yes.
her body was completely reviled.
Thank you. Yes. And I was, that. Thank you so much for that. The Hottentot Venus, who was, yes?
Yeah, but one last thing. If you
Oh.
read Hegel's,
I think we've moved on. I thought you were going to say something about the Hottentot Venus.
If you read Hegel's Phenomenology of Geist, you
Uh-huh.
will see that he will all deconstruct all these images which you are decepted by. Which is
Yeah.
Phenomenology of Spirit.
Are you, whoa. Let's not go back to Hegel, because Hegel was not really talking about Kim Kardashian.
We're just using Hegel.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think it's easy to understand.
Yeah. We're actually on to race now, and I think a very, very important point has been made about Saartjie Baartman, the Hottentot Venus. She was paraded around in the 19th century as a kind of archetype of uncivilized femininity. And yet, of course, she was fetishized, and she looked not unlike, her ass was like that. And you know, there's a guy called Sander Gilman who wrote a very interesting book. I can't remember the title at the moment, but there's a whole chapter on Saartjie Baartman. She's fascinating, actually very, very sad, because she and there's a guy called Otto Benger, who was a pygmy, who is actually exhibited in a cage next to monkeys. I mean, I could go on about this. But I think, as it's been raised, and as I throughout this lecture, I have been saying to you, there is an intersection of race and gender throughout cultural history since, probably time immemorial, certainly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So that actually one of the things I wanted you to note about this body was the way that the exaggeration recalls certain archetypes of black womanhood. So there's a whole load of stuff going on here that is highly problematic. I think I'm going to have to finish in a minute. My legs really hurt. Just one more slide, maybe. Yes, okay. I'm not going to go on about this at length. I'm going to try and persuade Jeremy to let me have a couple of sessions in April to talk to you about post-humanism. My friend Rosie Bradotti is actually writing a book at the moment called Post-Human Feminism. This is new theory. This is very, very new theory, and it freaks some people out and upsets people a great deal. But essentially, we're beginning to ask what it means to be human, and that actually what we thought of as human has, as I pointed out earlier, the default human has for some time been the white heterosexual male, and that everything else kind of is a a deviation from the ideal, and that posthumanism then becomes a body of theory which questions what it means to be human in the first place, the limitations we put around the idea of the human, asks what is human opposed to, and how do we recognise humanity? And that is highly problematic. Actually, we find that it's a tiny category that nobody occupies securely, and that we can all fall outside that category so easily. That people of different races and women and people who are thought of as somehow deviant sexually have always fallen outside and become monsters. So that the category of the human becomes a contingent category and one that is very insecurely occupied. I'm not going to go on about it at any great length, but it's a question to take away with you. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you all in April. Cheers.
Right. Do people want to make any announcements, or should I make the first announcement?
Do it.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to shout. So, first of all, as you know, some of you, maybe all of you, that this was part of the Antiuniversity kind of ongoing program, and that tomorrow afternoon, evening, we're going to meet to kind of reimagine the Antiuniversity to see what it could be more differently otherwise. So if you're interested, come and speak to me. And more directly in response to this wonderful presentation, like there couldn't have been a better context to talk about the feminist anti-fascist action that is organised, and that would be part of the wider anti-fascist action on the 9th of December, where Tommy Robinson and his lot will be marching on London. So over the last few months, a group of women and non-binary people and allies have been organising as the Feminist Anti-Fascist Assembly to kind of think about all those connections that actually Deborah mentioned between fascism and the hatred of women, and how they are kind of reproduced in our society under capitalism, and obviously marching, stopping fascists on the street is a very productive way to kind of perform that resistance. So again, if anybody's interested in joining the Feminist Anti-Fascist Assembly and Action on the 9th of December, come and speak to me. And there are other feminist anti-fascists in this room, actually. Who else got announcements tonight?
Well, you should, yes.
That's it? Cool.
Oh no, it was great last time. Loads of people came up and made announcements. It was brilliant.
What about extinction? No? You not got anything to say?
Yeah. Me and my friend came to this course a few years ago, and it kind of very influenced what we do. And we've been working on the Extinction Rebellion thing for a while, and it's kind of taken off a bit. And if anyone's interested, you can go online and read about it. You can talk to me as well. There's a meeting tomorrow. I think it's in town in the Quaker House. In central London.
Which one? The Quaker meeting house, I think.
What is it, Miles?
I think it's the Extinction Rebellion having a meeting at the Quaker.
Right.
So I think it's the Central London one, not the Houston one. But that's all online. And it's been quite interesting working on it. Because it's a sort of non-hierarchical post-consensus, which basically means get the fuck on with it, take responsibility for your actions, and then get feedback from the group and move forward together.
Anybody else?
No more announcements?
Do we? I don't know what Extinction Rebellion is.
What?
Let's fix Miles.
What? Yeah.
And maybe a question. I mean, we can all talk to each other about stuff that we want to know from each other. Because maybe when you said at the beginning, like, oh no, this is the end. What should we do next? If people wanted to self-organize this form of education or another form of mutual education, that's what the Antiuniversity is all about. And if there's a group here that wants to self-organize something out of this, then do it. Basically, and as the Antiuniversity, we totally support it in terms of finding its place or telling other people about it. But yeah, do it, get organised, whichever way you want. Brilliant, thank you so much, Deborah.
You're
What a
welcome.
legend.
Yeah.
Tuesday.
Wrigley
Road
Road
to
Market
Market
Bar.
Bar.
I
This is
don't see
working
why
out
we're
quite
not
I enjoyed
something
it
else.
too.
Yeah.
Are you gonna come to the thing?
Yeah.
Oh, I could get
Oh,
my shoes. I want
Thank
to,
you.
and I have maybe I should not do what I'm planning to do. Go on the I'm sorry.
Can we set up like? Should we set up a WhatsApp or something?
We
Sure.
just do it right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like tonight. Yeah, yeah. That sounds great.
We're here, I guess.
Yeah. You have to. What's the big pick though? What's the?
What to read.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping Deborah is
The what?
help us with what to read.
Actually, there's quite a lot. I mean, if you look at the PDF, actually, throughout them, there are various things that you could look into.
I bet we can get like 2 out of every session. There were at least like 2 different
Yeah,
reading.
I think it'd be brilliant if you started reading through it.